Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be taking a deep dive into hate speech in India today, and we're going to be primarily using a 2024 report from the India Hate Lab as our guide. What's especially interesting about this report, with your interest in Bangladesh, is how events in Bangladesh fueled a surge in anti-Muslim sentiment across the border in India. So I know you've been deep in this report. What's the biggest takeaway for someone like you with a particular interest in this region?
Well, the report found a pretty significant trend, a 74.4% surge in hate speech events across India in 2024. So, we're talking an average of, 3 hate speech events per day, and a large portion of these incidents were directed at Muslims and Christians.
3 a day. That's a really big jump. What's driving this really concerning trend?
Yeah, one of the main factors the report highlights is the 2024 general election in India. Political rallies and campaigns, especially by the ruling BJP, became a breeding ground for this type of rhetoric.
Now, you mentioned the connection to Bangladesh earlier. How did events in Bangladesh actually play into this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that the report brings up. So, back in August 2024, there was a period of political instability in Bangladesh. And unfortunately, this was accompanied by, let's say, exaggerated reports of violence against Hindus. This narrative quickly spread into India, and it definitely fueled this anti-Muslim sentiment. The BJP and Hindu nationalist groups kind of picked up on this, and they exploited it.
So it wasn't just politicians fanning the flames.
Right. The report specifically calls out Hindu religious leaders and organizations like the VHP and the Bajrang Dal for actively participating in spreading hate speech.
And of course, we can't ignore the role of social media in amplifying these messages.
Yeah, definitely. The report found that a staggering 995 out of 11,165 hate speech events were shared or initially live streamed on platforms like Facebook and YouTube.
Okay, so hate speech is clearly widespread, but what does it actually look like? What kind of messages are we talking about here?
So the report actually provides some really chilling examples. We're talking about speeches that call for violence against Muslims, including calls to arm themselves and even destroy places of worship. There are also examples of these conspiracy theories, like love jihad and land jihad, that frame Muslims as this threat to Hindus.
It is concerning that these speeches went beyond just words and actually encouraged people to act. The report refers to this as dangerous speech, right?
Yeah, and it's a pretty serious issue because a large portion of this, including some pretty explicit calls for violence, came from senior BJP leaders. And then those messages were spread through social media. It goes beyond just expressing opinions and enters the territory of inciting real-world harm.
So with your expertise, what are the major implications of this rising tide of hate speech in India?
Well, the report paints a pretty bleak picture, honestly. This kind of normalizes hate speech, creates an environment of fear for minorities, and really undermines democratic values. And the fact that a lot of it is coming from those in power is a major cause for concern.
It definitely raises questions about where things are headed. We've talked about politicians and religious leaders, but the report also dives into the specific content of this hate speech. What were some of the repeating themes and narratives that stood out to you?
One of the things that really struck me was how this hate speech taps into these pre-existing prejudices and stereotypes. It kind of weaves them into these narratives that dehumanize entire communities. For example, there's this recurring portrayal of Muslims as outsiders in Hindu India as if they don't belong.
This outsider narrative, would you say it connects to those conspiracy theories you mentioned, like love jihad?
Definitely. These conspiracy theories are really central to reinforcing this us versus them mentality. There's a lot of fear-mongering around things like love jihad and population jihad that are used to portray Muslims as this threat to India. It's a dangerous game they're playing.
And it seems like the Bangladeshi infiltrator narrative fits right into that based on what we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The report shows that this Bangladeshi infiltrator idea is a major element of this hate speech. It's used to create this fear and distrust of Muslims, painting them as this threat to national security. And the events in Bangladesh that we talked about provided the perfect opportunity for this rhetoric to spread.
The report also talks about dangerous speech that specifically targets places of worship. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is one of the most alarming aspects of the report. A significant number of hate speech events, like 274, actually included calls to seize, remove, or even destroy places of worship belonging to Muslims or Christians.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact this has on people. And what's even more disturbing is that most of these calls came from BJP politicians, often in BJP-governed states.
It's clear that this isn't just talk. It's about creating a climate where discrimination and violence against minorities become acceptable.
It's a reminder that we have a long way to go in the fight against hate speech. And the fact that social media plays such a big role makes it even more challenging. We'll talk more about that after a quick break. Stay tuned.
You know, it's interesting how social media is like this double-edged sword in a way. On the one hand, it can be this incredible tool for connecting people, but on the other hand, as this report shows, it can also be used to spread hate and encourage violence.
That's true. It's like the same things that make social media so engaging, like those algorithms and the echo chambers, are also what make it so effective for spreading hate speech.
Yeah, exactly. And the report actually talks about how these platforms prioritize engagement above everything else. Their algorithms are designed to keep people scrolling and clicking and sharing. And the problem is that hateful content often generates a lot of engagement, even if it's like negative engagement.
So you have these algorithms pushing content to people who are already maybe predisposed to it. And then you have these echo chambers forming where people only see stuff that reinforces their biases. It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. The report highlights how this can create a really distorted reality for people. Hate speech becomes normal, even acceptable. And this is especially dangerous when you think about how influential these platforms are, especially on younger people.
So what are these social media companies doing to actually address this? Are they taking any responsibility for the role they're playing in this?
Well, it's kind of complicated. All the major platforms have these community standards that ban hate speech, at least in theory. But the report points out that the enforcement is often inconsistent and not really enough.
Yeah, it seems like they're always playing catch up. There's just so much content being uploaded every day, and it feels like these companies are more worried about making money than actually protecting their users.
That's a fair point. And the report calls out Facebook and YouTube specifically. As of like February 2025, 98.4% of the hate speech videos they identified were still online, even though they clearly violate the platform's own rules. And remember, this includes videos with that dangerous speech, the ones calling for violence.
That's a huge number. It's kind of mind-blowing that they just let this stuff stay up. Are there any consequences for them? Any accountability?
There have been some attempts to hold these companies accountable. The report talks about how the Indian government has pressured platforms like Facebook and Twitter to remove hate speech. And there have been some cases where people have sued these companies for not taking action. But it's really tough. These companies have so many resources to fight back.
It sounds like we need a more comprehensive approach, something that goes beyond just asking these companies to police themselves.
I think so. The report argues that we need stronger regulations and more transparency from these companies. Things like stricter content moderation, better ways to report hate speech, and actually holding these companies accountable for the content they allow.
And this isn't just a problem in India, right? We're seeing this with hate speech and online extremism in other countries too.
Absolutely. It's a global problem. And the report recognizes that events in one country can affect other parts of the world. Like how the situation in Bangladesh fueled anti-Muslim sentiment in India is a perfect example.
It shows how interconnected everything is. So we've talked about how big this problem is, the role of social media, and the need for accountability. But what about solutions? What can we actually do to combat this?
The report has some recommendations, and it emphasizes taking a multi-pronged approach. It suggests things like increasing media literacy, having education programs that teach tolerance, and creating stronger laws specifically against hate speech.
So it's about changing attitudes while also having laws and consequences in place.
Yeah. And the report really stresses how important it is to hold those in power accountable. It's one thing for some random person to say hateful stuff online, but it's much worse when it's coming from politicians and religious leaders.
Right. It sends a dangerous message when people in positions of authority condone this kind of behavior.
Absolutely. And the report highlights how a lot of this hate speech comes from within the BJP, the ruling party in India. So it's not just some small group, it's becoming mainstream, part of the political conversation.
It's a reminder that we need to look beyond just the platforms and address the underlying social and political issues that allow hate speech to spread. We need to directly challenge those ideologies and promote respect and inclusivity.
Definitely. The report suggests things like promoting interfaith dialogue, supporting organizations that combat prejudice, and encouraging open and honest conversations about these tough issues. It's about creating a society where hate speech isn't accepted, where people take action against it.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to mention one more thing from the report that really stood out to me. It talked about how music and poetry can be used to spread hate speech. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, that's one of the most disturbing parts of the report. It shows how hate speech can show up even in these forms of cultural expression that we think of as beautiful. The report found examples where music and poetry, things usually associated with good things, are being used to spread hate and encourage violence.
It's a reminder that hate speech can be really sneaky. It can hide in plain sight.
Right. That's why it's so important to be aware of this and to be critical of what we see and hear, even things like music and poetry.
We need to be more critical thinkers, asking questions like, who made this? What are they trying to say? How could this affect people?
Exactly. It's about developing that ability to tell the difference between real art and something designed to spread hate.
We've talked about how big this problem is, the role of social media, and how hate speech can show up in unexpected places. But what can we do as individuals? It can feel overwhelming to fight against something so big.
I know what you mean. But the report emphasizes how important it is to speak out against hate speech, both online and in person.
So don't let those comments slide. Challenge the people who say them and let them know that their words have consequences.
Exactly. It can be as simple as calling out a friend who shares something hateful online, or speaking up if you see it happening in public.
That takes a lot of courage, especially when you might get pushback. But it's important to remember that if we don't say anything, it's like we're agreeing with it.
Another important thing is supporting organizations that are fighting hate speech and promoting tolerance. There are so many groups doing great work, and even small donations or volunteering your time can make a big difference.
And let's not forget about education. The report talks about how important it is to teach media literacy and critical thinking skills, especially to young people.
Definitely. We need to give people the tools to identify hate speech, understand its effects, and come up with strategies for challenging it.
It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding, where those values are the norm.
And that starts with each of us. We all have a role to play in making the world a better place, a place where hate speech isn't tolerated.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening, though a bit concerning. It's alarming to see how hate speech is becoming more common, especially online. But I'm leaving with a sense of hope, knowing that there are people out there actively working to fight this and build a better future. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Yeah, it is kind of scary how easily music can be used to spread hate. And what's even worse is that people often don't even realize it's happening, especially when it's hidden within something they're familiar with.
It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're sneaking these harmful ideas into people's minds using something they already enjoy.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to think critically about all kinds of media, even music and poetry.
We all need to be better critical thinkers, right? Like
Yeah.
asking ourselves questions about who made this and what they're trying to say and how it could affect people.
Yeah, it's all about looking at things with a critical eye and being able to tell the difference between real art and something that's meant to spread hate.
So we've uncovered the scale of this problem, the role of social media, and how sneaky hate speech can be. But what can we as individuals do to push back? It can feel so overwhelming, like one person can't make a difference.
I get that, but the report really stresses the importance of speaking out against hate speech, whether it's online or in person.
So don't just ignore those comments. Challenge the people who make them and make it clear that their words have consequences.
Exactly. It can be something as simple as calling out a friend who shares something hateful on Facebook or saying something if you hear it happening in public.
That takes a lot of courage, especially because you might get negative reactions.
hmm
But it's important to remember that if we don't say anything, it's like we're condoning it.
And another important thing is supporting those organizations that are fighting hate speech and promoting tolerance. There are so many groups out there doing amazing work, and even small donations or volunteering can help.
And education is crucial too. The report talks about how we need to teach media literacy and critical thinking skills, especially to young people.
Absolutely. We need to give people the tools to recognize hate speech, understand its impact, and have strategies for challenging it.
Ultimately, it's about creating a culture of respect and understanding where those values are just the norm.
And that starts with us. We all have a role to play in creating a world where hate speech isn't tolerated.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. The issue of hate speech is complex, and the fight is far from over. But I'm leaving with a sense of hope knowing that there are people out there actively working to combat this and create a better future. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.